How do you know if you love God? Is it just kind of like a feeling like we have when we love people? Sometimes we sing worship songs and we might experience this real emotion toward God. Is that what it means to love God? Maybe. But the problem is, have you ever known some people who really are vibrant worshipers of God, but they have another side? And you know about it. In their personal lives, they're very different. They may be unethical. They may be jerks. They may just be hypocritical. And you think to yourself, they're just awful to be around. They can't love God. There's a film called The Apostle, and the main character, Sonny, is a preacher. He's got a wicked streak. Is he fake? Or is he just like so many of us who we're just walking contradictions, trying, sometimes failing, to love God? Well, this week, as we continue our study through the book of Exodus, we're in chapter 24, and we're going to meet some people who express their feelings to God. Now, we've just come through a section in our study of Exodus, chapter 20, verse 22, through all of chapter 23, in which God gave Moses what is called the Book of the Covenant. We haven't heard it referred to as that title yet, but I'm using it now because the narrator in our story is going to actually give it that title in what we're going to be talking about today in chapter 24. So let's begin. In chapter 24, verses 1 and 2, God instructs Moses to come up on the mountain. This is a repetition of what we already heard a few weeks ago in chapter 20, verse 21. Moses, his brother Aaron, Aaron's 2 sons, and then 70 elders are with him. Now, all those other people are worshiping at a distance. So, this repetition of what we already read back in chapter 20 really means that here in chapter 24, between verse 2 and verse 3, occur the giving of that Book of the Covenant that we just studied a few weeks ago from basically chapters 20 through 23. Well, now we get to verse 3. And Moses now goes and tells the people about all this that he learned from God, all those laws in the Book of the Covenant. But first he says that he communicates to the people the Lord's words. That's likely a reference to the 10 words, the 10 commandments from chapter 20. And then he says he tells them the laws, the Book of the Covenant. How do the people respond? With one voice, they say they will obey it all. Then we read Moses writes it all down, and the next morning he builds an altar with 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel. Together with the people, they sacrifice to the Lord. This is like a worship service. Moses reads the book of the law. It's like he's reading the Bible in this worship service. The Book of the Covenant that he had just received. He reads it to them, and afterwards, again, the people respond, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." This is an expression of love to God. Now, in verse 8, as this worship service continues, Moses sprinkles sacrificial blood on the people, declaring that it is the blood of the covenant made between the Lord and the people. How do you feel about that? Moses sprinkling animal blood on people? It sounds disgusting. In our culture, blood is something to be avoided. I mean, think about it. When you're playing sports, if there's a collision, someone starts bleeding, immediately the game stops. They have to go off court, off field, and be treated. We don't want to touch blood, whether it's human or animal. We try and stay away from it. So why is Moses sprinkling animal blood over the people? Well, in the ancient Near East, ratification of a covenant between two parties was done through the sacrifice of animals. The blood of the sacrifice was the symbol that the two parties were agreeing to each of their sides of this covenant treaty. Sometimes this is called a suzerain-vassal treaty. A suzerain is a king or a lord, and the vassals are peasantry living on the land. owned by the Lord. In the treaty, the two parties agree to their terms of what their relationship will be like. So, for example, the suzerain might say, I will provide you that land and military protection as long as you farm the land and give me 10%. Yahweh's covenant with the people of Israel works very similar to a suzerain vassal treaty. If the people obey the law of God, they will be able to dwell in the promised land, and God will protect them from their enemies and bless them. But if the people do not obey the law of God, he will remove his protection. They will experience what it means to be cursed. So have we seen in this passage so far, through this worship service where they are ratifying the covenant, the people repeat, they will obey the Lord. So when Moses is sacrificing this animal on this 12-stone altar, he is leading the people in this binding agreement with the Lord. Also, for those of us who are Christians, there's a phrase in there that should sound very familiar. The blood of the covenant. Do you remember the Last Supper where Jesus met with his disciples in the upper room the night he was before he was arrested? He explained to them that his blood, actually the cup which would have held wine, was symbolizing his blood. The blood of the new covenant, he said. So whenever we partake of communion, we eat the bread, which symbolizes Jesus' body broken for us, and then we drink the cup, symbolizing Jesus' blood of the new covenant shed for us. Jesus was the sacrifice upon which God's new covenant with the church is ratified. And whenever we drink the cup, it's very similar to Moses sprinkling the blood on the people there in Exodus chapter 24. Now, of course, when Jesus is referring to the new covenant, he's indicating that the new covenant supersedes the old one. It's the old covenant that we're reading about here in Exodus 24. But over the course of many centuries, Israel would go on to break the terms of that old covenant, something that God very clearly charges them with through the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel. He then, God, predicts through those prophets that he will start a new covenant one day. It's a promise that he fulfills in Jesus. And so as his disciples, you and I are under that new covenant agreement. Now, if you want to read about that further, I encourage you to go to Hebrews chapters 8 and 9. It's amazing to think that we can be in relationship with God. But back in Exodus 24, in verses 9 through 11, after that worship service is over, Moses, Aaron, his sons, and the 70 elders now go up the mountain. And we read something astounding. They saw God. This is extremely rare in Scripture. People just don't get to see God. At least not if they want to live, which we're going to read about in a few chapters in Exodus 33. Only Moses is able to see God face to face. So it's likely here in Exodus 24 that the people are only seeing God in a sense. Sometimes it's referred to as seeing God's back. But this all raises a question here. Moses seeing God face to face, the elders here seeing God's back. Does God even have a face and a back? I thought he was a spirit. And a spirit, by definition, has no physical form. Well, some commentators suggest that these references to God's back and face, and we're soon going to hear about his hands, that they are anthropomorphisms. And that's just simply a big word describing when humans use human characteristics to describe non-human entities. Literally speaking, because God is spirit, he has no form. No back, no face, no hands. But so that we humans can at least partially grasp what was going on in the mountain, the writer refers to people as seeing God. Those people are not actually seeing God. Now, some might wonder, but couldn't God take on human form in order to make himself more accessible to humans? Of course he could. And he does, in the person of Jesus. Jesus is God in the flesh. But that's not what seems to be happening here in Exodus 24. Instead, it seems that Moses and the others saw God's glory, meaning that likely God manifested himself in a brilliance that would be very, very difficult to put into words. So imagine with me, it's later that day. Everyone has left the mountain except Moses, which we're going to find out about. These other 70 plus, they come back down the mountain and people are talking with them and they're like, we saw God. And the people are like, what? You saw God? What did he look like? The priests and elders at that point would really struggle to put human language to what they saw. So their only recourse is to use human characteristics. In fact, we see the prophet Ezekiel do this in the book of Ezekiel, describing God in chapter 1, verses 26 through 28 like this. He says, above the vault over their heads was what looked like a throne of lapis lazuli, and high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and that from there down, he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking. So Ezekiel gets this vision of God, and he is just doing his best to describe what he cannot possibly describe. He sees what is like a bunch of brilliant, shiny things. He sees what is the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. So Ezekiel is really being wise and circumspect about his ability to make any kind of description of God. And so therefore, what we're reading here in Exodus 24 is likely the same. That's why in verse 11, the narrator writes this: God did not raise his hand against these leaders. We know that God doesn't have a hand. Instead, again, we have to think about this. The writer is saying that the people saw God. They saw his glory. But God restrained whatever it is about his glory that would have normally killed them. And what did they do? It says together they had a banquet. They ate. They drank. They're likely celebrating this covenant that God had made with the people. Now, I did skip one interesting detail. When the people saw God, they noticed that under his feet was something like a pavement made of sapphire, or lapis lazuli, clear as the sky itself. What is this pavement? Well, we don't know. It sounds like what we read in Ezekiel. Remember Ezekiel describing a throne of lapis lazuli or sapphire? Here again, words fail the writer. Kind of wonder, is this a description of another dimension, like a portal to another dimension, the heavenly realm? Is it holy ground, like the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3? At the very least, it seems to symbolize God's otherness, his holiness, that God is set apart from us. The narrative continues from there, and God tells Moses to venture further up the mountain with him, just Moses and God. And God says, then he will give Moses tablets of stone upon which will be written the law, the commandments. So Moses asks his aide Joshua to come along with him, instructing the elders and the people to hang back and wait. And the elders and the priests especially are to be among the people in case any disputes arise. You might think to yourself, what does he mean? Why is he concerned about disputes? Does it sound ominous? Probably is meant to be ominous. A foreshadowing. The writer is alerting us to the possibility of some trouble on the horizon. But for now, though, the chapter finishes with Moses on the mountain of God. We read that God's brilliant, fiery glory cloud descends on the mountain and sits there for 6 days. And on the 7th, God calls Moses to join him in the cloud. And we learn that from the vantage point of the people looking from down below, this fiery glory cloud seemed like it was consuming the mountain. If you and I were down below, we would assume that if Moses does what God says, enters into that cloud, it would surely kill him. I mean, what else could we conclude if we saw Moses walking into that? Well, maybe the elders and the priests would say, well, hold on a minute. We met with God. He did not raise his hand against us, and so Moses could be okay up there. But people are people. Hysteria could set in. Moses has been their leader, and it would be jarring to watch him walk right into what seemed like something that should kill him instantly. And it might be unsettling enough that they would disagree with the elders and the priests about being calm and waiting. And what we learn next is even more difficult. Moses goes into the firestorm. And in verse 18, it says he stays there for 40 days and 40 nights. Now there are other famous 40s in the Bible. Noah's Ark, 40 days. Jesus was in the wilderness, 40 days. But neither of those are instances where people are left behind waiting. In Exodus 24, I mean, think about it. The people have just entered into covenant with God, proclaiming that they're going to obey him. Their leaders have this wonderful celebration banquet with God. It seems like everything is starting off so well. But then, if you're one of the people watching what just happened, it could really be seeming like things took a quick 180 to disaster. There is a correct sense in which they're a little bit scared of God. I mean, think about the fire cloud. And he calls their leader, Moses, to join him in the fire cloud, and the leader doesn't come back. Now, you and I know that, of course, Moses eventually comes back. But the people of Israel, they're just watching this. So when your leader makes a seemingly careless, maybe even suicidal move, you wonder, even if the other leaders try to appease your doubts, saying that God can protect Moses in the firestorm, how will you feel when Moses doesn't return? For a day, 2 days, 3 days. Would you start being worried? You'd be assuming he's dead. He probably died the first minute of being in that firestorm. And I could be thinking that, our nation just entered into a covenant with this horribly deviant God who kills his most loyal servants. I could be very scared, thinking that the entire nation is a sitting duck out here in the wilderness. But then more days go by, a whole week. If there was a little sliver of hope, it could be turning into despair. Then another week goes by, no Moses anywhere. Then a third week goes by. It could seem like Israel is just doomed. And then a fourth week goes by. People are thinking, what should we do? Where was that angel that God promised us back in Exodus chapter 23? Now, remember that foreshadowing that we talked about in verse 14? That idea that the elders and the priests were supposed to handle disputes from the people? When you pair that up with the reality of verse 18, that Moses is gone for 40 days, the author is setting us up. He's writing drama into this narrative. We don't yet know what will happen. That is, if we're reading this for the first time. So, with all kinds of emotional tension gripping us, at the end of chapter 24, we just stop. It's kind of a cliffhanger. At least if we're viewing the story from the perspective of the people of Israel. It's brutal. So what do? Well, you and I can reflect on Exodus chapter 24. We can reflect on the fact that God enters into covenant relationship with his people. He's a relational God. And God's covenant, as we saw back in chapters 20 through 23, it's based on his heart of justice. He desires what is best for his people. He wants flourishing and shalom. It really seems like the people recognize this. They're excited. They agree twice to do everything the Lord said. Now, you and I are in covenant with God. We're in relationship with God, but through the new covenant. And so, actually, we can evaluate, are we saying and then doing what the people of Israel said in Exodus 24, that attitude of obedience? Jesus numerous times will go on to say that the people who obey him are those who love him. We show that we love God by following his commands. So evaluate yourself and your love for him. Is the fruit of the Spirit growing in you and flowing from your life? Are you making disciples? Are you keeping your heart and mind focused on Christ? Are you practicing the habits of Jesus? I encourage you to listen to the Spirit. Have him say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Is there anything from today's devotional that you sense God is asking you to dwell on and to think more deeply about?